Are video games dangerous for kids? Some people seem to think so.
Is it turning their brains to mush?
Although Sonic the Hedgehog is innocent enough, the content of some of the games is not innocent, and there are serious concerns that some of the more adult games that children are actually having access to are not desirable in any way at all.
It's dangerous for the children and it's dangerous for the public, and it seems to me it's absolutely outrageous to teach children to maim and to murder and to mutilate in the way that this video undoubtedly does.
But moral panics are nothing new.
Well, of course, I've only seen it on television, but my own feeling is that, like a good deal of modern dancing, it is pagan in origin and in expression. And as one looks at the faces of those who are doing it, one cannot help but feel that it's having a bad spiritual and mental effect upon them.
I think that the movement that has come about in rock music today, which can take a young person and captivate that young person's mind. We have been called deprogrammers of young people. Well, at first I didn't like that term. The more I got to thinking about it, the more I did like it, because I think somebody better start deprogramming these young people.
Finger pointing and fear mongering are never going away. There's always a new scary thing to be up in arms about. But what is all the fuss about? Could there actually be an issue? People have been coming out against video games for being too addicting or for being too much fun to play since the very beginning. First it was Mortal Kombat, then it was the Columbine kids playing Doom, and now it's Luigi playing Among Us. I don't really get why sites run stories like this. Like, what really do they think people are going to learn from reading an article like this? These days, it's not even just about the games themselves. Game launchers like Steam and chat clients like Discord are now also suspect. Video games are also viewed very differently depending on where you are in the world. But good or bad, some places are writing laws to crack down on gaming in the name of protecting kids. In Japan and South Korea, gaming is a normalized part of the culture, and top esports figures are celebrated as mainstream celebrities. It might be starting to thaw a little, but cultural attitudes toward gaming are somewhat more negative in China.
The government had to be, quote, ruthless in imposing the restriction. It said that online gaming hurts young people's physical and mental health and hinders their ability to study.
Yet all these places have or have experimented with laws limiting the time kids can play games. Gaming-friendly Korea had a law from 2011 to 2021 preventing kids under 16 from playing video games between midnight and 6 a.m. In Japan, the video game's motherland, the Kagawa Prefecture passed a law in 2020 saying kids under 20 are limited to 1 hour of gaming per day on weekdays and 90 minutes on weekends. Japan is split up into 47 prefectures, which are sort of like states, and Kagawa is on the smaller side population-wise, so it would kind of be like if Maine or New Hampshire broke rank and passed a law like that. China has a national law similar to what they passed in Kagawa, 1 hour on the weekdays, 2 hours on the weekends, but the difference is apparently they go hard enforcing this with real name registration and crackdowns, whereas in Japan it's more of an honor system thing. Can you imagine living somewhere with a law limiting everyone under the age of 18 from playing games for more than 10 hours a week? Whether that's the state level like Japan or countrywide like China, that's just less than 6% of the total hours in a week. That seems kind of hardcore. Maybe it is, but what if there's a good reason behind it? Why would China bother coming up with a law like that and chasing after people to follow it if they didn't think maybe there was something the matter with letting kids play unlimited video games? Why would Korea and a prefecture in Japan also experiment with it? What's going on? Do they know something we don't? Or could they be the ones watching too many 90s news reports? It's important because I think kids are awesome, and I hope to have some of my own one day. Video games were a big part of my life growing up, and I think it was in a good way, but I definitely want to know the latest thinking on this before I do anything that could stunt a kid's development. In a vacuum, video games aren't inherently good or bad. It's how you use them. Important sounding research bodies have researched the violent video game angle to death, and nobody's ever been able to find a link between violent video games and mass shootings or other horrific acts. But that doesn't necessarily imply nothing bad could possibly happen if you let kids play whatever they want as much as they want. There's people who admit to being video game addicted, and we've all seen the Dr. Phil episodes, but which came first, the game or the excessive usage patterns. To find out if games are dangerous for kids, the first thing that's important to do is to try honing in on what exactly is unique about gaming. You don't want to get hung up on problems that you could just find anywhere. One example of something that's not unique to gaming is the idea of exposure to violent or otherwise objectionable content. Personally, I think the most violent movies are a lot more graphic than anything I've ever seen in a game. If you look at the list of objectionable content on the ESRB's website, I'm pretty sure you could just as well get this stuff in a movie or a comic book. So if you want to say that games are bad for kids because of the stuff on this list, I think you have a much bigger fight on your hands than just games. What could be unique to gaming is the degree of interactivity. You aren't just observing the graphic depiction of some scary thing, you're actively taking part, and in some cases being rewarded.
You're engaged now as the aggressor. You're engaged as the person who commits the violence, not just someone who watches the violence.
Let's start with violence. A study done by the American Psychological Association found no evidence linking playing violent video games to actually committing violent actions. But it did find a small and reliable relationship between violent video game exposure and aggressive outcomes.
Today, we spoke to Jason Pace. So he was a developer on the whole Halo franchise and is currently the executive director of UW-Bothel's Future Digital Lab. And we asked him if there's some sort of a link between video game violence and real-life violence.
There is a pretty strong case for a link. You can see this in the American Psychological Association's assessment for increased aggression when you play violent video games. So people who play a lot of violent video games tend to become more aggressive. There is not a strong correlation for that aggression translating into physical violence. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It just means that we haven't made a strong case for that yet. So it is safe to say that people will become overall more aggressive frequently when they play violent video games, not necessarily more physically violent.
If I see they are getting too upset over it, I will turn it off for them.
You got it last time, retard. You beat the level.
Knock it off. I'll take it away. I will take it away.
Extended sessions with violent video games may put you in a foul mood, it turns out. That's interesting to me because it says, hey, that big scary idea you see on the news basically isn't true, but you should know that there's this lesser thing that is true that's not ideal and could also happen. The APA also issued a policy statement in 2017 aimed at politicians and the media, urging them to avoid linking violent video games with violent crimes, reiterating the subject of their findings over the years. I guess the website that ran the Luigi Among Us stories didn't get the memo. That said, we also have to balance that with the potential benefits of gaming at a young age. A study from the National Institute of Health found gaming associated with better cognitive performance in children, with kids who played games for 3 hours per day or more performing better on cognitive skills tests involving impulse control and working memory.
You're always talking about this demeaning making kids' minds like vegetables. Talk about them out on the street smoking pot.
So much for gaming turning your brain to mush, and so much for those 1 hour per day time limits. Games can also act as a sort of gateway to technology and could get kids interested in computer science or any number of STEM disciplines. I couldn't really find a study supporting this, but I would definitely say that happened for me. Low sample size, of course. Then there's just plain old stress relief and a form of play for hanging out with friends. Today, over 90% of kids play video games, and kids aged 8 to 17 for between an hour and a half to 2 hours per day on average. Who would argue that a little Mario Kart with friends is really such a bad thing? Another concern is games could be too addicting, leading to either too much playtime, too much money spent, or both. The phrase too much of a good thing comes to mind. If you're addicted to games, the logic is it would lead to the physical problems that come from sitting around too much and cause you to fall behind on your life responsibilities. Is gaming addiction a real thing? Well, clearly someone can be addicted to anything. We've seen My Strange Addiction, but it's also the case that certain things are more addicting than others. Some things seem so compelling that the average person would have a hard time engaging in the activity without developing a problematic usage. Could games be too much fun? Is resistance futile? Imagine a future dystopian world where AI created a game that was so fun to play that people couldn't stop playing and they died of starvation sitting in their chair, enjoying every minute of it. That's not 100% science fiction. In 2005, a guy in Korea dropped dead after a 50-hour marathon StarCraft session, and in 2015, it happened to another guy in Taiwan, though this article doesn't say what he was playing. People have died for their video games, but finding one single example of something terrible happening doesn't really prove much on its own. People have also died of exhaustion from working too hard or for exercising too much. It's also possible to die of drinking too much water at one time, but you wouldn't say water's an issue and we need to monitor or limit how much our kids consume. It's about balancing the good with the bad. The reason games are fun is because your brain releases dopamine while you play them. Your brain functions and controls your body by releasing different types of chemicals. One of those chemicals is dopamine, which is what makes you feel joy when you reach a goal or something exciting happens.
You react to stimuli that bring pleasure to you, and does the bar go higher and higher and higher where you have to have more and more and more? That's why when people are using heroin or cocaine or meth, a little bit is okay to start with, but then it takes more and more and more. And what has been indicated is that with gaming, they're beginning to see the same sort of high, the same sort of anxiety and withdrawal, which you're experiencing when you don't have access to that, because the brain has changed.
The concern is that a video game would hook an unaware kid. The brain will need more and more dopamine hits, and eventually it prevents you from enjoying anything else, because it's just not as stimulating as a video game. Excessive gaming is classified as a disease by the World Health Organization. In 2018, they classified gaming disorder as a mental health condition, but others say there's nothing there. The authors of Moral Combat: Why the War on Video Games is Wrong say playing a video game or watching an amusing video online causes roughly about as much dopamine to release into your brain as eating a slice of pizza. By contrast, using a drug like meth can cause a level of dopamine release 10 times that or more. They cite this study published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. Among those who played games, more than 2 out of 3 did not report any symptoms of internet gaming disorder, and findings showed that a very small proportion of the general population, between 0.3 and 1%, might qualify for a potential acute diagnosis of internet gaming disorder. A National Institute of Health study found that regardless of how researchers and medical professionals assess the nature of a gaming disorder, few who play video games experience negative consequences from doing so, and at best, only a small subset of players might be considered to suffer from an addiction to it. It's very important to remember when you're reading this stuff that correlation is not causation, and all these studies are correlational by design. To assign causation, you need to set up an experiment where the effects are randomly assigned. But that's not really viable here because it's not ethical and probably not even possible to run an experiment where researchers randomly assign some test subjects to become problem gamers. You kind of just come into it naturally one way or the other. The newest concern is that gaming acts as a sort of gateway to gambling problems later in life. Back in the day, you bought a game and that was that. But starting in the 2000s, games started going free to play and offering random paid unlocks, which you'll sometimes hear called loot boxes or gacha mechanics. The idea behind this is instead of selecting something and buying it for a stated price, you're paying to unlock one of several things, sort of like the spin of a wheel. And usually you have a higher chance of winning a common item versus a much lower chance of getting something rare or valuable. The funny thing is, it's really the exact same thing as opening a pack of Magic or Pokemon cards, hoping you find something super rare. The perceived issue here is it's much easier to sit in your house pouring money into a game, whereas you'd have to get your mom or dad to drive you to the store to pick up cards back in the day. Some games keep these unlocks only to cosmetic items, while others sell characters or equipment that might affect gameplay. Some games follow best practices, like posting the odds of winning, while others are a bit more sketch about it. In 2025, Genshin Impact settled a lawsuit with the US Federal Trade Commission over selling loot boxes to players under the age of 16 and allegedly deceiving children and other users about the real cost of in-game transactions and odds of obtaining rare prizes. Genshin had to pay the US government $20 million, agree to stop selling loot boxes to people under the age of 18 without parental consent, and to disclose loot box odds so people at least know what their chance of getting what they want is. This is a newer trend, so there are less studies out there compared to something like violence or just playing too much. But gambling mechanics are now very mainstream. Regulators in Denmark found it is almost impossible for kids to avoid microtransactions and gambling-related elements, but also that microtransactions do not immediately carry a risk for young people in relation to a gambling addiction. The gateway to gambling effect has not been formally investigated, but a survey of 1,102 people who both purchase loot boxes and gamble found that 19.87% of the sample self-reported gateway effects, loot boxes casually influencing subsequent gambling. The majority of participants reporting gateway effects were under 18 when they first purchased loot boxes. But this is also potentially selection bias happening. Lastly, a study done on 2,213 kids aged 11 to 17 in Spain found a positive relationship between the purchase of loot boxes and gambling online 6 months later. It kind of looks like a chicken or egg thing. Do video games turn you into a compulsive gambler? Or did someone who was predisposed to irresponsible spending sort of find a game that took advantage of their existing issue? Are games the cause or the crutch? It's early, hard to know. I want to give the final word to a recent deep dive book on the effects of technology on kids. In Jonathan Haidt's 2024 book, The Anxious Generation, he seems to fall on the view that social media is the cause of today's teen mental health crisis, but video games are more of a mixed bag. The main point of the book is that he thinks kids should not have smartphones until they get to high school and should be off social media until age 16, because it's really that bad. But his findings for video games are a bit more nuanced. He talks a lot about the positive and negative effects of games, and comes down on the side of it's not really worth banning it like social media, but it is also something for parents to keep their eye on. You should pay attention because if your kid starts falling behind, games are really fun, so they could make it a little tougher to catch up. He cites the fact that boys' academic performance has been worsening and their college attendance has been dropping for decades. And he doesn't say it's fully because of games, but suggests that they may exacerbate the trend. According to Haidt, about 7% of boys end up as problematic or addicted users, which is a bit higher than some of the studies quoted above. Though he acknowledges that only a small minority of gamers develop a true addiction, he does sort of paint a picture of games sapping kids' motivation and warping their social development. He says, video games can cause severe problems for a substantial subset of heavy users, where the key is not just the quantity of play, it's the role that games have come to play in their lives. They impose a large opportunity cost, they take up an enormous amount of time. At the end of the day, the question isn't, are video games dangerous? It's how do we make sure our kids grow up with them in a healthy way? Every form of media, from books to movies to music, has had its moral panic phase. But video games really are different. They're more interactive and immersive, and in some cases, actually designed to get a player hooked. But we don't have to conclude that games are necessarily bad. Instead, we should be asking, how do we make sure our kids don't get lost in them? The same way we teach them not to eat junk food for every meal, and not to spend all day scrolling through social media. The danger is not the game itself, it's its unchecked usage. Some kids are going to come home, play Mario Kart after school with their friends, and move on to something else. Others may find that they use games as an escape from their real-life struggles. If video games really are too fun, to the point where some kids struggle to stop, I don't know that the answer is necessarily to ban them. I think the challenge is making sure that the rest of their life is exciting and engaging enough, so video games don't seem like the only activity worth doing. It's not just about the games, it's about everything. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all soon.